Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Thank you very much for coming back to see me, Big Chris, and of course, not forgetting the old receding hairline. Can't forget that in a video. Now, in today's video, let's talk about an era where we do have a lot of facts, but equally just as much mystery and fiction, and that is, of course, yes, the Middle Ages. Now, the big problem with these Middle Ages is that although we have a lot of fact, those Victorians like to add a little bit of spice to this particular era, which leaves us asking the question, what is fact and what is fiction? So here we go. This is one of the most fascinating periods within our history. We have the Magna Carta, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War. But out of all of this era, how much do we actually know? Here's a question. They weren't all knights, serfs and clergy. Now, although certain medieval writings describe societies as being divided into three parts, we had people that prayed, people that fought, and people that labored away. Now, this became increasingly inaccurate as we went past the 1100s. Now, the population of Europe increased hugely across both the 12th and 13th centuries, with cities and towns becoming much larger. In fact, both London and Paris increased tenfold. Now, the cities and their populations did a variety of different jobs. You had people who were carpenters, you had butchers, weavers, architects, painters, and also the occasional juggler. Now, in the countryside, not every person was some kind of impoverished serf. Now, a serf is an unfree person who is tied to the land. Now, many peasants were actually free men and women, and they owned their own land. Now, whilst there were a certain degree of unfree people, this didn't mean that they didn't own goods and land. And there were certainly poor people out there who were oppressed. But this wasn't a universal thing. Here's one for you. People had the vote. Well, sort of. Mainly the male population. But we have to remember, in the Middle Ages, we didn't have the same voting rights and laws and responsibility that we have today. So an example, in France in the 12th and 13th centuries, many of the towns and villages had local elections for both consuls and councillors. Unfortunately, as we said earlier, it was mainly for the male population. Sorry, ladies. Now, when it came to the more national elections, the more complex ones, where leaders were being picked, we tend to find that we see this evidence in the northern Italian states, where they had more structures. Here's another one for you. The church didn't conduct witch hunts. Now, the large-scale witch hunts and collective paranoia, which was responsible for the stereotypes of these evil witches, wasn't a medieval thing, but rather an early modern phenomenon found mostly within the 16th and 17th centuries. There were some witch trials in the Middle Ages, and these became more widespread within the German-speaking lands of the 15th century. But those doing the persecuting were almost always civic authorities and not the church authorities. Now, for much of the Middle Ages, the main message, the main thing that the church wanted to get out to the people was that magic was a foolish thing. They had a renaissance and invented many experimental sciences. This is the next one. Now, when people talk about the Renaissance, they usually mean a very specific, conscious embrace of classical models, such as literature and art and beautiful architecture that we see all around us. This is usually taken to be one way in which we move from the medieval period all the way to the early modern period. But here's the thing, the fact is that the medieval period had a lot of intellects, also classed as the Renaissance of the 12th century, where we see great works such as Aristotle and great works from even the Arabic-speaking countries of the Middle East. They make their way into Europe and people start to study this, like I say, as early as the 12th century. Now, one of the outcomes was to prompt an inquiring and reflective approach to the actual physical world. An example of this is Roger Bacon, and he was amongst many people who wanted to observe and experiment with the physical world and learn more about it. I've got another very interesting fact. They travelled and also traded over very long distances. Now, it may be the case that the majority of the medieval world, particularly those who lived in the peripheries of towns and countryside, rarely travelled very far at all. But that wasn't always the case for everybody, and we see during the age that people travelled quite far. Now, when we look at the medieval world, we see some of the great pilgrimages to great lands. We see some of the great journeys, thousands of miles on trade missions, and those involved in trade certainly did travel, linking parts of the world together through selling and buying, and these were extraordinary distances. Even in the early Middle Ages, all kinds of high status goods were being transported vast distances from vast shores of Europe all the way to Asia and into China. We had the silks of China, we had the spices from Asia, we had the great goods from Europe. We talk about the amber, we talk about the furs, all being exchanged around the world. One of these famous people was a guy known as William of Roebuck, and he travelled to the eastern parts of the world where he had a 3-year journey which begins in 1253. Here's a very interesting one. There was also an immigration policy in the Middle Ages. Now, although the residents of medieval England didn't always roll out the red carpet for the Welsh, the Scottish and Irish immigrants, they had some very great folk customs. Much of the public culture of the Middle Ages was shaped and at least informed by Christianity. But there was also some quite curious customs, usually tolerated by the church, but which may have had very old roots. Now, one was the practice found in many different parts of Europe, where they would get rolling, burning barrels and send them down a hill on Midsummer's Eve. Another was to throw wheat over the heads of newly married couples. It was almost common to raise money by charity by holding, this is a fantastic idea, a help ale charity raising fund drinking party. I hope I'm invited to the next one. There was undoubtedly a number of things that we look at as superstitions, often to be invoked in these superstition protections against disease and bad harvest and all evil. But the midsummer festivals and the ale charities also sound like a pretty good thing to me as well. Now, you don't have to get married in a church. This is fascinating, this one. In fact, you almost certainly didn't get married within a church. Those who wanted to get married usually do so at the gates. Yes, the gates of the churchyard. But in any case, couples didn't need the church or a priest or the writings to get married. So let me explain. The church, they certainly did want people to do these kind of things. And since around the 12th century, it had started to argue that marriage was a formal sacrament between you and God. You bring both parties together. But in reality, in practice, and also in law, people got married by simply declaring that they wanted to marry each other. Now, they had to have consent, and ideally there should be at least a few witnesses, just in case one of them changes their mind. But you could get married back then very, very simple. Now here's another one for you. Most great medieval authors didn't write. We tend to think of literacy as one thing, but in fact it combines a variety of different skills, of which the physical act of writing is only one of them. Now, for much of the medieval period, works as such as scribe writing have been seen as a kind of labour and was not something that was tremendously clever or important people would undertake. So they would often give it to somebody else to do. So instead, they would usually use the medieval equivalent of a voice recognition software. So a scribe would write down what the person was saying. I find that very, very interesting. Here's another one. Some people weren't very religious. So the Middle Ages is famously featured great examples of extreme religious and mystical and saints and all these great pilgrimages all around the world. But it would be very wrong to assume that people were always focused on God and religion and the definitions of doing things right and doing things wrong within the medieval period. There is pretty solid evidence that some ordinary people who looked to God for answers, but also a lot of people who decided that their lives and doing simple jobs and looking after their family was already enough work without needing to get God involved. So when it comes to the ordinary people of the Middle Ages, what we tend to find is that instead of looking to a higher spirit, they often looked to their local communities for answers. So when the harvest was bad, instead of blaming God, they often looked at logical explanations for this, which I find, once again, very fascinating, as we're always told that God plays a big part. Now, there is always ample evidence of people just simply not bothered about religion, most of all not going to church on a Sunday. So one Spanish priest in the early 14th century reported to his bishop that hardly anybody is attending church on Sunday, but they seem to be just larking around the streets, playing and doing whatever. And others record a simple sense that the majority of people would simply rather do something else on a Sunday. Here's another one for you. They didn't believe the world was flat. We should know this by now, but most people now know this fact. It's pretty much like when the Vikings didn't invade foreign lands with big horns on their heads. But one thing we do know is that them Victorians, they love to make elaborate stories about the past. But what makes studying medieval history fascinating is that you have to grapple with both puzzles of extracting information from difficult and often fragmented surviving records, and the challenge of constantly checking your own thoughts and assumptions about the medieval past. So once again everybody, that is my video on the medieval Middle Ages. What do we know as fact and what do we know as fiction? So thank you very much for joining this video with me. I'm Big Chris once again. Big receding hairline, we can't forget that. And if you like this type of video, please like, subscribe, put lots of comments in the comment section below. Ring that little dingy dongy bell if you can. And once again, have an incredible day and I'll see you on the next video.